Tonight's debate will focus on whether New York should expand the use of rent regulation. We're pleased to welcome our debaters as they present their arguments as to why New York should or shouldn't do so. And we may not agree on the best way forward, I'm sure we don't, but I think we all do agree that dialogue itself is valuable. Welcome to our moderator. Where's our moderator? There he is, New York State Assemblyman and current NYU Wagner Distinguished Visiting Urbanist, Michael Blake, and our debaters, Afua Atta-Mensah and Rafael Cestero. They will receive proper introductions shortly, but on behalf of NYU Wagner and the Century Foundation, thank you very much for joining us this evening. We are live streaming tonight's events. Hello to those of you online. When we first began discussing this series with the Century Foundation, we all agreed that a vital part of the program would be hearing from you, the audience. And there are two ways you can take part in tonight's conversation and ask questions. Number one is Twitter, and number two is old-fashioned index cards. So for Twitter, submit a question using the hashtag DOTC, which you will see in your programs and on the screens. And the second way to ask a question is by writing it on an index card. Simply raise your hand at any time during the debate, and an usher will pick up your index card from you. They also have extra index cards if you didn't take one on your way in. Before we start, we want to take your pulse about tonight's topic. So we're going to conduct a little poll right now, and then again, we'll do the same thing after the debate and see if we managed to change anybody's mind. You can join the poll in one of two ways. You can join via text. So take out your phones and simply text DOTC to 37607. Alternatively, you can join from any web browser. Go to paullev.com. Is everyone ready to poll? Okay, we're going to poll. Tonight's resolution is we should expand the use of rent regulation in New York. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? After you've joined the poll, simply text yes, no, or undecided. Give it a minute while people vote. Okay. So we will do another poll after the debate and see if we've managed to change anybody's minds in either direction. But it's now my pleasure to turn the stage over to our partner in this endeavor. So Wagner's been around for 80 years, and I'm really proud to turn this over to somebody who's been around even longer. This is the Century of the Century Foundation, and my co-host, Mark Zuckerman.
Thanks to Dean Gleed for her continued partnership in supporting these debates that we've done for a few years now. For those of you not familiar with TCF, we are an independent, progressive think tank based here in New York, and as Sherry said, we're celebrating our 100th anniversary this year. Our policy research is centered around the very issues that Americans talk about around the kitchen table. We promote access to higher education, help advance diverse, high-quality public schools, and support universal health care proposals with a focus on race, gender, and equity. On the economy, we're looking to support more high-wage jobs and give more support and help to hardworking families, such as comprehensive child care. Tonight, though, is all about the public policy issue that New Yorkers are particularly passionate about, which is rent regulation. And luckily, fortunately, we have one of the city's public servants here to help navigate tonight's debate. Assemblymember Blake is a powerful force in New York City, in Albany, and on the national stage. He's a native New Yorker, born and raised in the Bronx. He is a visiting distinguished urbanist and adjunct professor at the Wagner School right here, a public service, and he's serving in his third term in the New York State Assembly representing the 79th District. He served in the Obama administration and currently he is a candidate for the 15th District of New York congressional seat. Let's give a warm welcome to Assemblymember Blake. Thank you.
Mark, thank you, of course, for your leadership, and of course to the Century Foundation for 100 years of being engaged, and of course for the support tonight. To Sherry, thank you for your phenomenal friendship and leadership as Dean here at Wagner. We are grateful to both of you for us to be able to host tonight's debate. I think we can all agree, based upon the attendance in the room tonight, that we care slightly about rent regulation. Either you're for or against what has happened this year in Albany. And I will say, in full disclosure, I am a member of the Housing Committee. So I was slightly involved in the negotiations that happened with this. As a chair of the Mitchell-Lama subcommittee, we can talk about that another day. In June, as you know, we passed many of the sweeping changes that happened across the state. For context, again, we are in session from January to June in the legislature, and this was one of the final items that we changed this year because of date certain necessity. It was designed to give stronger protections to our New York City renters. There were many changes that happened along the way, some of which included a security deposit and having it only be for 1 month as opposed to first and last month, which we heard from people regularly, application fees, tighter controls on rent increases. What could landlords do, especially when it came to major capital improvements, that's something that we would hear regularly from constituents across the city. The elimination of vacancy decontrol, which is something that we would regularly engage in that conversation of why was it easier for someone to have the opportunity to be removed from their homes because of a decision of a landlord. Many other elements as well. So those in support of these new regulations are obviously engaged, and many of them are tenant rights advocates, which we will hear from one of the great leaders across the city and across the state tonight in Afua, to argue that the regulations were necessary for New Yorkers and all the people across our city. When you think about 65% of residents across our city being renters, and just internalizing the magnitude of the number. But you also have to recognize that there were significant viewpoints on the other side, and that there were very legitimate points that were being raised, especially for those that not only were landlords, but just the question of should some of these challenges go into place. There was a dialogue that would happen of should this be permanent, why is this permanent, the question of the impact on what this would do on today. And so that brings us to tonight. For us to have this conversation, you've been given instructions on how to poll, how to submit your questions. It seems like, Rafael, you got to get ready because of what we saw in the poll right there. We'll be looking forward to that. But just so we're clear, allow me to introduce our two great debaters. I'll introduce them and then bring them up to stage. Afua Atta-Mensah is a wonderful ally and leader. She's the executive director of Community Voices Heard, where she has been working and fighting regularly when it comes to quality, fair, and equitable housing to defend racial and social justice initiatives. Prior to this, we were able to do a lot of work together in her role at the Urban Justice Center, Director of Litigation and Policy for the Safety Net Project, again, giving her critical expertise on that. Director of Policy at the Center for Working Families, and if she didn't have enough background before that, a staff attorney at the Legal Aid Society and a Fulbright scholar in Ghana. So no pressure right there. Rafael Cestero obviously came prepared as well. He's our president and CEO of the Community Preservation Corporation, a leading nonprofit that has been focused on affordable housing and community revitalization. He himself also has great track record. He's previously served as the commissioner of New York City Department of Housing Preservation Department, HPD. Before and during that tenure, he helped implement and oversee Mayor Bloomberg's new housing marketplace plan, a multi-billion-dollar initiative to finance the creation and preservation of 165,000 units of affordable housing. They are both incredibly prepared, qualified, and I ask that you put your hands together as we welcome them both to stage right now. So we're going to have some fun tonight. This is not going to be, UFC, WWE style right now. Everybody going to be in their respective corners as we're here. So just so everybody's aware of our format and our conversation and what will be happening here, we're going to begin with opening statements by both of our debaters. They will both have 5 minutes for the opening remarks. There will then be an opportunity for a rebuttal by both of them. We'll then dive into some particular questions that we'll have that I will share, as well as questions from the audience. And as Sherry mentioned earlier, don't forget to submit your questions on index card or submit them via Twitter throughout the debate. We will have them and be able to respond accordingly. With that, let us begin, and I'll start to my left with Afua.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Yes. Great. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
So as was noted by our esteemed moderator, my name is Afua Atta-Mensah, and it is my pleasure to be here with you all tonight. I'm an individual who was blessed to be part of an organization, Community Voices Heard. and we are long-term actors in the housing justice movement. We are not only fully in favor of extending rent regulations across the great state of New York, but we're proud actors in the decades-long campaign to strengthen and broaden the reach of rent regulations, which was partially realized in the previous legislative session in the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act. Now, for the purposes of tonight's conversation, I'm hoping that we can agree on two basic propositions. I know that times are rough with the advent of fake news and whatnot, but I hope that at the very least we can agree on two things. One, that there's a fixed amount of land in this world that the Lord is not making any more of. And two, that there's a housing crisis in New York. And I don't use the term housing crisis lightly, and I want to note that I'm not the first person to say that we're in the midst of this crisis. In New York City, more than 40% of households are rent burdened, which is defined as paying more than 30% of their income towards the rent. Tom Waters, in his 2019 study of rent affordability across the state, notes that in cities and towns like Newburgh, Rochester, Elmira, and numerous others, there are clusters of families who are paying more than 50% of their income towards rent. This is part of a national trend outlined by the Joint Center for Housing Studies, which illustrated that since 1960, renters' median earnings have gone up about 5%, while their rents have spiked 61%. Now, how does this manifest itself in real life? What does it mean to be rent burdened without the protections of rent regulation? Well, many families are forced to use their savings to pay rent as the increases woefully go past their meager incomes. And if the majority of one's income is going towards rent, it decreases their ability to save, further exacerbating income inequality and reducing the ability of workers to weather the next recession. While I know tonight has been billed as a debate of the century, the premise of rent regulation is from a previous century. It first came to prominence in the 1990s during World War II as a reaction to the unjust monopoly that landowners have over renters. Now, surprisingly, there's still a lot of myths around rent regulation, what it is and what it is not. Rent regulation is a check on the market to help preserve the supply of affordable housing. But it also recognizes the legitimate interest of long-term tenants in remaining in their homes. It is not a subsidy program, nor is it a silver bullet which alone can help to stabilize communities and protect renters. However, it is an important tool. For far too long, families outside of New York City, Long Island, and Westchester have been not allowed to realize the protections that are part and parcel of rent regulations. The Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act is a huge step towards rectifying this. A few of the rights that were mentioned by the esteemed moderator is that the elimination of the vacancy bonus, a tool used by some landlords to remove homes from rent regulation. Preferential rents now last for the duration of a tenancy. For those of you who are seeking an apartment, security deposits are now only limited to 1 month rent. And at the end of your tenancy, you should receive that deposit within 14 days. Application fees can no longer be more than the actual cost of background and credit checks. And most importantly, families across the state can realize rent protection. I've been talking a lot about tenets of rent regulation and its history, but be clear, this is not a debate about widgets or market forces, but about people and their homes, actual families who span the great state. And when I talk about the housing justice movement, know that we are talking about a movement for dignity. We engage in the fight to extend rent regulation because of this tangible ability to impact for the better the lives of New Yorkers and for the ability for them to stay in their homes. Thank you.
Round of applause for Afua. For his 5-minute opening, Rafael.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here tonight. I hope that the outcome of this is open dialogue and discussion about what is, I think, Afua and I completely agree on, which is that we have a housing crisis here in New York City and across the state, and that we have very real issues around tenant protection, around housing quality, around housing affordability, that need to be addressed not just by one tool, but by a series of tools that come together to create a system that provides an intervention in the housing market that I've spent 30 years of my life being a part of. So there's no disagreement from my perspective, that we have a housing crisis in this state and across the country, and that there's a very real need for government to step up in a significant way and intervene in that market in order to protect tenants and protect neighborhoods and ensure that everybody, regardless of your income, has a decent, safe, affordable place to live. So I hope that we can agree on all of those things. And then really it boils down to me to the question of the day, which is less about what's happened in the past and more about what are we going to be doing going forward. And so the question of should we deepen rent regulation in New York City and across the state, I think is a very important question for us to think seriously about. I think it starts with really understanding the system that we have here in New York City today and what is available at the moment for other places around the state, which is to opt into the system that was created here in New York City, where rents are set by a rent guidelines board that is made up of political appointees, where you have a complex system of things called MCIs and IAIs that allow owners to have some incentive to invest in their buildings, and that is highly regulated by a state housing agency that, although under the actions in June, got more money to help it manage the system and to help enforce the regulations, is overtaxed and is underfunded in its ability to really administer a highly complicated program. So my premise for tonight is really that this complicated system that has evolved over decades is not the best system to achieve the goals that we agree on. That the system that we have today is a product of a very specific market and a very specific set of politics here in New York City. And that it is very hard for me as a housing practitioner that has worked all across this state and across the country to accept that we're not smart enough to come up with a system that is flexible enough to work for the communities that are not just like New York City. I have two very specific concerns about expanding. One is that 40% of the rental housing units in New York City and 70% of the rental housing units in New York State are in buildings with fewer than 50 units. Buildings with fewer than 50 units are owned by mom and pop owners. They're owned by small entrepreneurs who own real estate and are managing that real estate. They're not owned by big landlords that have become the political noise around this issue. And this system that we have in New York is so complicated that it's incredibly hard for them to manage the system and to understand what they can do and can't do. Tenants don't understand their rights under this system, and neither do small property owners. My second issue is that upstate New York, I was born and raised in Rochester, New York. I know upstate New York. Upstate New York's issue is about a stagnant economy, and it's about deep, deep, deep poverty. It's not high rising rents, and it's not about low vacancy rates. And I think we need to be thinking about what do we do to solve upstate New York's problems, not just import a model from New York City.
We are at time. Let's give a round of applause for Rafael. So as both get a chance to provide a rebuttal, and since we are so engaged in social media, we're going to do a little thing real quick. Afua, what's your Twitter handle?
Oh, at Afua Atta-Mensah, because nothing comes easy, right? The full name.
So if you like what you're hearing, make sure we're engaging in Twitter. Rafael, what are you using? Is it you or for CPC?
Well, I don't even know what CPC. I'm not a Twitter guy. I'm an old man. I don't know what time.
It's CPC? Okay, so if you like what you're hearing, make sure to include that in. Afua has 3 minutes to provide a rebuttal to Rafael's comments.
Thank you. So I want to make sure that we take some time to clear up some misnomers, right? Rent protections were things that were hard fought for in the tenants' rights movement, not just in the city of New York, but in municipalities across this country. And I want to give you some surprising information. Rent regulations exist outside of the city, right? I talked about the counties of Westchester and Long Island. And so I would argue that tenants are very clear about what part and parcel of rent protection. They organized. They took action at Albany. They spent money to come together to ensure that they had things like an annual rent increase, right, that is propagated by the Rent Guidelines Board, so that they would have a right to a lease renewal as opposed to being subject to the whims of a landlord. And what I'm arguing is that while rent regulation is not a silver bullet, it should be at least the floor, the baseline for what we're doing as a society to protect renters, because they're families who want to build a home and community just like anyone else. I myself and our organization are fully in favor of other methods that will deepen protection from renters in communities across New York. But we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Rent regulation is the beginning. We argue that there should be even more controls, like things like good cause eviction to protect renters across the state so that they are able to ensure that they have the right to continue to live in an apartment, even if they're not subject to rent stabilization. And moreover, there's been recent studies that note that rent regulation does not necessarily correlate with the diminution of new housing being built. I want to direct folks to a study by David Sims in 2007 that looked at the effects of what happened when rent control was ended in Massachusetts. Sims found that the elimination of rent regulation led to significant rent increases in the quality and a diminution in the quality and quantity of the rental housing available. Part and parcel of what I hope this conversation will move us towards, more of an innovation of big ideas when we accept that, yes, renters too have a rights, right? And they're building families just like anyone else who want to have the protection for their homes so they can have dignity and peace in this world. And how we're going to move forward to ensure that renters have rights, that landowners or landlords are able to be in good relationship with those folks, and that there's regulations to protect us all.
Rafael, you have a chance for 3 minutes for your rebuttal.
I actually think that there's a lot of things that we agree on. I completely agree, and I'm a wholehearted supporter that tenants have rights. We have a city in New York that's 65% renter. That's the opposite of most of the rest of the country. People make their homes. They live in their apartments for 30, 40, 50 years, and they're renters, and they never own a home. That is a unique characteristic in the sense of 65% of the housing stock is rental in New York. And I think that is 100% true across all of upstate New York. I also agree and completely understand that rent regulation is a part of the system that we have in New York today, and that is increasingly becoming part of the system that is out there nationally to achieve the same goals. Other places are approving rent regulation systems that are simpler, that are more transparent, that provide the same level of tenant protections, and provide appropriate incentives for owners to make sure that housing quality remains strong. So what my proposition is that we are New Yorkers, right? We are the best of the best, and we should come together around what works in the system that we have today, what doesn't work, and then learn from what other people are doing around the country and create a system that is both about rent regulation, but is about tenant protection, is about affordable housing construction, affordable housing preservation, is about understanding that a big part of the housing affordability crisis is not just the cost of the rent, but the income of the renters, and really have a serious conversation about income support for renters and the way in which we're bringing all of those things together to achieve the goals that we agree on.
So I'm hearing multiple points here. It sounds from Afua, this is the baseline. There's more opportunities to grow from here. You raised the example of good cause eviction as an example of that. Rafael, it sounds like the core of there should be more transparency, and it should be simpler because of the complexity of it all. But just so we're all clear, it does not sound like either of you believe we should be starting over.
No.
That we should be building budgets in different directions. Is that a fair assessment or not fair?
Starting over in New York City?
Correct.
No, I do not think we should be starting over in New York City.
No.
And so let's start from the place of let's help crystallize this conversation because it can be very large and big to grasp. Is there one data point, one takeaway that you think best articulates your argument as to why we need rent regulation in the present form that's been proposed and implemented, or why you believe this change should happen otherwise?
Sure.
For you.
So I would say that rent regulation does not curb or stop any other innovations or ideas. In fact, we fully support and wish that the government would take time to come together and think through a New York statewide plan of how we are intentional about creating and building truly affordable housing for New Yorkers in Rochester, Syracuse, Schenectady, Albany, Yonkers, and here in New York City, right? And often, though, this argument is crafted that it will curb, rent regulation will curb this and will harm housing affordability only after it's enacted. There were many decades in which government entities could have come together to have a big think, right, in regards to how we do this in upstate and make this system better. That didn't happen. So tenants came together to organize to fix things for themselves, right, and to try and bring some stabilization for communities across New York and to fight for their homes. So the big proposition that I would have for folks is to take a moment and think about your home. Take a moment and think about if that's in jeopardy and what that would mean for you, your family, and your life choices. And I'm hoping that we can come together to agree upon that that shouldn't be the fate of anybody here. And that we should be thinking together of how we can both create affordable housing, but we'll never just build ourselves out of this problem. We have to preserve the units that are currently there for the families here in New York City and across New York.
Rafael, what would be your core point to distill as to why this is not currently the right path?
So I would offer two very specific data points.
See people out here breaking the rules, you know, always saying.
I know, but they're specific data points which you asked for. One is that the current rent regulation system that we have in New York, 57% of rent regulated tenants are rent burdened, meaning their rent that they're paying in their rent regulated unit is not affordable to them. And so we're not solving the affordability crisis for them. We're providing rent increase protection, and we're providing a whole host of tenant protections so that they can't be adversely treated. But we're not creating an affordable living environment for them. So that's number one. And then second is that the majority of multifamily rental buildings in New York State are small buildings. They're small buildings, which is also where most of the low and moderate income people in our state live. 40% of rental units in New York City and 71% of multifamily buildings, multifamily rental units in upstate New York have fewer than 50 units. 67% of these in upstate New York are in fair or poor housing condition. And the rents in these places are, by all standards, the most affordable in the market. So the question for me is, within the system that we're designing, how are we ensuring that housing quality remains good and that we're not just providing a cheap rent, but we're providing a decent, high-quality place for people to live?
So I think then Afua, Rafael is driving home the point on his side of this is not fixing the core problem of income inequality, affordability, et cetera, that we essentially are addressing one dynamic, but not the deeper one. Do you think that's accurate?
Not fully. What I would say is, again, these regulations do not prohibit further discussion, debate, and hopefully action to deal with the issue of the affordability crisis. But while the quantitative impacts are hard to dig into immediately, over time we're saying that this will keep about 1 million apartments affordable to working class New Yorkers. And again, it seems that whenever there is movement to solidify rights of a segment, that there is always a converse that this will harm other things or we could do something else. There were 30 years to try and come together without a lot of groundswell on how do we do this, right? My colleague was excused because I know he's been part of a long-term fight for affordable housing, but it has not crystallized. And this is not just about keeping a few units cheap. When I talk about the idea of stability, in New York City, we're very used to getting the right to an annual rent renewal and things of that nature. That doesn't happen on these other municipalities. And in the adverse of doing nothing for decades, the idea that doing something new to try and enact these to allow us to start and to tinker around the edges should be something that I think folks can get behind.
And that would seem to be a fair question to pose out there, Rafael. If we've been in this situation for decades and nothing occurred, why? Why did nothing occur until this year? We all recognize the gravity of the problem.
Well, I guess I would point to two things. And first, I think, and foremost, is to be extremely clear that much of what was changed in the rent laws in June, I supported and advocated for many years. So why did it take June to happen? And we can talk about what I didn't support, but why did it take June to happen? And I think there's a couple of things. One is, I think for decades, and I will put myself in this category as a former public official, we failed to listen as well as we should have. New York City has been a growing city for two plus decades. People are moving in. People want to be here. I've been in New York City for 30 years. When I first came here, nobody wanted to be here. So we're a growing city.
Well, as a Bronx, I don't know about that.
What's that?
I said I was a Bronx, I love being in New York.
I know you love being in New York, but most of the Bronx back in 1988, nobody was living in. So, but I guess my point is that we've gotten to a place where the way people are experiencing the growth of the city is higher rent, crowded trains, overcrowded schools, and overcrowded neighborhoods. And that's not a way in which people should be participating in the growth of the city. And so we need to find a new way to do that. The one thing that I do want to just take somewhat of exception with, which is, Afua said that, I'm paraphrasing, the rent regulation conversation doesn't preclude us from having other discussions. In my experience in 30 years doing this, the rent regulation debate in Albany has precluded us from having many different conversations because housing is tied to rent regulation. And there were any number of things that we tried to get done when I was in government in Albany that we were not able to get done because rent regulation was the overarching item for discussion. So I do think that unfortunately, the debate around rent regulation has sucked a lot of the air out of the discussion about what else should we be doing. And I'm hopeful that we can now move past that because changes that have needed to be made for a long time have been made. And we can move to a place where we're having a real conversation about what else we should be doing to help support the families that we all want to support.
I do want to come back because you raised it, that there were items that you didn't agree with, so we'll come back to in a moment. I want to give Afua a chance to respond since Rafael mentioned you.
Sure. I guess the only thing that I would just say is that I would push back that rent regulation stopped the debate. Politics in Albany stopped the debate. And tenants came back and fought and worked hard to elect a slate of senators who were clear about who sent them to office, right? So it wasn't the topic, it was the state of politics. And what changed that, what shifted that was a shift in power and narrative, right? And folks coming together to make clear that change does not happen by debates in pretty rooms like this. Change happened because we took Albany. Change happened because hundreds of people got arrested. Change happened predicated on 30 years of a tenants' rights movement that people in this room helped to put forward. So it wasn't the word, it was politics. It was some part of the real estate lobby in New York moving millions of dollars to quell those conversations in small smoke-filled rooms. We brought those conversations out front and said no more.
Well, as a NYU distinguished urbanist, I love our rooms, Sherry. Just so you know, we love these rooms here itself. So let's, to try to crystallize the point here, can you raise your hand in the room if you're a renter? Okay. Keep your hand up if you feel or know that you are rent burdened. Let's see that again. So put your hands down. Let's do one more thing. Raise your hand if, based upon the numbers I've said, 30%. Raise your hand if you are rent burdened. 30% is going towards your rent. Raise your hand. Okay. So let's take this from the theoretical. Let's make this practical and make this personal. Help us to understand how this practically helps or hurts someone. We're talking about the numbers, we're talking about data. Afua, how does the laws that were just passed practically help someone that is a renter?
I know I've been beating the drum about the right to a lease renewal, but it's something that so many of our members are so excited about. I mentioned that preferential rents will now be for the lifetime, the duration of the tenancy of the individual family. The average preferential rent, difference between the preferential rather and the legal rent, is about $500. And 250,000 families have a preferential rent in New York City. Now we know that families who are rent burdened, or even those who are close, that extra $500 is not going to go to an offshore account, right? That's money that's going to be spent right here in their local economies. So that's the real money that people are able to either use or save and spend in New York City. About 2.5 million New Yorkers in New York City and the surrounding counties average income around $40,000. Increased rental protections will help for more stability for those folks and protect against harassment and evictions. We didn't get a chance to really get into some of the protections for families who were about to go into housing court. But that are some tangible things that are helping tenants.
Would you, there was something specifically if you had mentioned that you had a reaction to.
CPC has been financing small building owners in this city for 45 years. We have put $10 billion to work to support small property owners in this town. I meet our borrowers, I know our borrowers. I don't know a single small building owner in this city that has an offshore account. So I take exception to the rhetoric about, oh, well, all the money is just going into offshore accounts. That's not really who's being affected. Let's put REBNY aside, because that's a completely different issue. Let's talk about the people that really own the buildings, because they're frankly no different than the people that are living in the buildings in many, many, many cases. And so that was what I reacted to, because I just don't think that rhetoric is particularly helpful, because most people don't have offshore accounts.
Due respect to my colleague, I'd never made the insinuation that landlords, I said that the tenants who are saving that money will not be moving them to offshore accounts. Am I
Well, but the
incorrect
insinuation
here?
is that the owners who would have been getting that money are putting it into offshore accounts. Come on.
No, sir.
That's exactly
I would say
what that
the
comment was
insinuation is that money
intended
will
to
be
be.
spent here and won't be held siloed. And
Okay,
if we're
sure.
going to get past rhetoric, then we have to not go into what intention.
So what did you mean by offshore
What I
accounts?
meant
Who's
is-
putting money in offshore accounts?
Not the renters.
Well, but
That's
who
what I
is then?
meant.
But that's my point. If it isn't the renters and the renters are saving the money, then when they weren't saving the money, who was the money going to?
My dear colleague.
landlords, right?
The money was going to the landlords.
Right? Who you're inferring were using the money to put them in offshore accounts.
So I know that we have only a certain amount of time, and I don't want to overstep the moderator, but I just want to again say
Let's get ready
that
to
my
rumble.
words should speak for themselves. I take no second seat to having to make inferences or sneak around. If I mean the landowner, I've said landowner at least 30 times tonight. I will say it continually if it was in regards to who I was addressing, and it wasn't. I yield time back because I don't want to.
So the premise point, so we're all on the same page. When you were referring to the offshore accounts was for the renter is not going to be utilizing that excess money towards that because they don't have
Correct.
that. Regulation is permanent. Good, bad, indifferent, portions of it that should not be permanent.
You're starting with.
I'm tossing it open.
Okay.
Look, I think creating a law that is permanent is not a reflection of reality. So we're permanently stuck in 2019. We've put laws in place that cap expenditures that are allowed to be made and that you get credit for towards a rent increase in 2019 dollars. So in 2035, are those dollars the same? Does $15,000 buy you the same thing in 2035 that it did in 2019? The laws of economics don't say that that's true. And so from my perspective, permanent to me means that we're stuck in 2019 and we're basically locking in a system and we're going to have a very hard time ever changing it. And that's not, from my perspective, good government policy.
I just want to touch on 2 points before going to Afua. One, we've mentioned REBNY a few times, the Real Estate Board of New York, different entity, the main opponents of what was happening here, so that we don't get caught in just talking about acronyms without conveying that, and that's not adding qualitative thought to them, just that clarification separately. And secondly, of course, we can always come back around with legislation to make changes along the way. As we talk about permanency, it's not saying that something can never be changed. It's just the current statute in that language. Go ahead. I mean, that's, with any statute, you can come back and make changes.
Right, but the laws of Albany would suggest that it'll be very hard to make that change unless there is a deadline or a reason for the debate to come up. Yeah. And that's just
I mean, as a
30 years of experience.
You know, as a legislator in Albany, I would say that you can make any change.
I mean, I
understand the point. I just want to make sure that
I don't think that's practical in the realities of how, unless Albany is going to completely change in how it works. I don't think that's the experience that most people have had in how Albany works.
I hear the point. I just want to make sure we're clear so that folks are leaving from here that there are the possibilities of change. That's all that we're conveying. I hear you on the politics of it. I'm acknowledging that. But I don't want people believing and walking away that nothing can be changed. That said, the core question, regulation permanent, good, bad, or indifferent, your reaction.
I would just say, to follow up on your point, the idea of a sunset is different than permanency, right? So there's no longer a sunset on this, to your point, Assemblymember Blake. So the statute has been enacted. But that does not by any means mean permanent or forever. Many of us who are in different movements for racial justice, economic justice, gender justice know that laws can be changed if there is a groundswell of support and folks who have an analysis and a self-interest in making those laws changed. So I think that we have to separate the ability to actually change laws to the realities of politics, right? There's a political reality that deals with issues of power. I submit that I think the real estate industry knows how to come together to build power, right? They have for years. And that I am confident that different members of the real estate lobby will be coming together to fight this voraciously each and every year. That's part of the battle. That's part of the ebb and flow in this fight for housing justice, right? So has the sunsets been eliminated? Yes. Does that mean it's forever? Not by a long shot.
There are index cards being passed around so that you can write down your questions, or you can still do them through Twitter and other means. Rafael, just going a step back, because I think this would be helpful. What would be some particular changes that you think should occur? You have said several elements that have been passed, you're on board with, and speaking on behalf of CPC. What would CPC's perspective of, here are the things that should have changed that did not occur?
Well, I think I would respectfully just rephrase the question a little bit. I think the piece of the legislation in June that even beyond the permanent question that I'm concerned about is the caps on how owners are able to recoup costs for repairs that are needed in their buildings. And the equation here is very simple. There's income that comes in, and there's expenses that go out. And if there's not enough money coming in to be able to invest as the buildings age, to replace boilers, to replace roofs, to replace windows, to replace plumbing lines, to do all of the things that are required to maintain a physical envelope of a building, if there's not enough money coming in, then the owners are not going to be able to make those repairs, and deferred maintenance will occur. And I would just say that people say that this is not, we don't need to worry about this. We're never going back to the 70s. But the truth is that we have seen this movie in New York twice. We saw it in the 70s and 80s with massive disinvestment. And frankly, we are living it right now with the federal disinvestment in, and not just in New York, across the country in public housing. There's not enough revenue to support the expenses. And so I'm not hyperbolic about it. I don't think the buildings are going to start falling down tomorrow. I just think that there's a legitimate concern that I think we went too far. We capped the IAIs at an amount that doesn't buy you much today and isn't going to buy you much in 2035, and we lowered the rent cap on MCIs, and I think that is stretching the system. Do I have real life examples today to support that point? No, but I don't think that's a reasonable question because the law just got passed 6 months ago. This is going to take time to work through the system.
And I would say that was a very continual, legitimate point that kept coming up throughout our negotiations this year. Just so we're not talking in our codes, because the three of us can do acronyms all day, every day. MCI's major capital improvements, IAI's individual apartment improvements. Those were the two thresholds that consistently kept coming up throughout the dialogue, that I would encourage everyone to learn about both of those acronyms, because you will see them and read about them pretty consistently as we move forward. I want to focus specifically on that. MCIs and IAIs repeatedly came up in the conversations that you would hear from your membership, Afua, the thought of what they were conveying from their perspective of the impact that was having on their lives.
Sure. I mean, and if I'm allowed to your broader question, is that okay? About,
absolutely.
So what I would say is that I hope that there is, I think Rafael and I both agree that there should be larger conversation about how to deal with the housing crisis in New York. I think I would urge that it's conversation that's tightly tethered to action. And just like all things, we're going to, frankly, if I'm honest, I think it's not going to do all the great things that those of us in the housing justice movement hope it will do. And the sky will not fall out like some members of real estate or landowners are scared of, right? It's going to be like most things, somewhere in the middle. And there's going to be an ebb and flow of folks coming together to try and rectify things where folks went too far and deepen where we need to. But the larger issue will still remain. So I think MCIs and major capital improvements and individual improvements are one of those things. And I would just say for a lot of renters, part of that push came because they were living in buildings where we had this thing called predatory equity, right? Where land speculators would come and buy buildings that they could only hope to meet the burdens of both their mortgage and to stockholders by exponentially raising the rents and bringing them out of rent regulation, right? So folks were rushing to put in marble, kitchen things and Wolfgang Puck type, stoves and all these things to try and get rent rates up, or doing all these improvements on the backs of tenants. So yes, tenants want an apartment in their building to be repaired. Clearly they have a stake in making sure there's heat in the winter. But I think part of this was about too long of a backlash of folks doing it in a way that was some, not all of course, that were unscrupulous and they're not being proper oversight. I mean, part of what's being fought for is to ensure that this is working, right? Is more assistance for HCR, which is the government entity, Housing, Community, and Renewal, that will have a lot of oversight in this, right? Because we believe strongly that you can't just have new legislation without the support. And the only thing I would just quickly say is I would take issue with my colleague on NYCHA as an example. Public housing, what's happening to public housing in America is a scandal, but it's not because of rent regulation, right? It's because there is a systemic disinvestment that's been happening for more than 30 years. And a lot of that systemic disinvestment happened when public housing authorities moved from being mostly white and middle class to black and brown. So I think there are a host of reasons, systemic racism being one of them, and federal government backing away from their belief in housing another, as to why NYCHA and the Buffalo Housing Authorities and so many across America are a national disgrace.
For us to, again, put this all into perspective, and I'll give you a chance to respond because you were mentioned by reference, if you will. So again, January to June was the timetable for legislation action to happen. Just so everybody's aware, the fiscal year for New York State begins April 1st. So you have from January to the end of March to negotiate on the budget, essentially $176 billion. Then you have from April to June to do final legislative negotiations in which the timing and the magnitude of what we were working through led us to doing this in June on this year. So as you think about moving forward that context, Rafael, would you like to just respond?
I would just say that I completely 1,000% agree with Afia's analysis of what's happened in public housing in this country over the last 4 decades. And my analogy was not about rent regulation being the cause of public housing. My analogy was simply that public housing has been starved of the revenue it's needed to invest in the buildings. But her assessment of what has happened in public housing is spot on.
I would agree. We can make that another debate for another day.
We'll be on the same side.
We'll be on the same side.
We don't have to. It won't be
How
a debate.
How do we fix public housing? Can go a lot of different ways, but agreed. I think we can all agree there. We have 3 minutes before we go to audience questions. Again, you can do them by index card. Several of you have been going online. We appreciate that. Rafael, I'm going to start with you, and then Afua, I'm going to go to you. We're going to talk about the cost as best as possible, the economic point that we want to drive home. From the conversations from your landlords, for those that you're engaging with, what is being conveyed as projected expense or cost from this implementation? There's always obviously the unintended and sometimes intended consequence that emerge, but it'd be helpful to convey what you see from that perspective.
I think like I said before, I think in many ways it's really too early to tell. There have been people that have tried to quantify the economic impact, lost taxes, all that stuff. I'm not here to advertise for those studies. What I will say is that what we know is that already in 6 months, property valuations, are coming down, and that's not a value judgment. I don't actually think that that's necessarily over the long term. I don't think that's the worst thing in the world. Excuse me. And so I think we'll continue to see that, and that's probably not a bad thing for as an outcome for this. So I think that's that's one, and then I think. The other thing that I would say is that I think that we're not, as I said before, we're not really going to know what the impacts are of the limits on the major capital improvements and the individual apartment improvements for some time, because those things are still churning through the system, right? One of the challenges with those things is they take forever to. At least MCIs take forever to get approved and move forward. So,
Afua, and again, I know this is new, but any data point you can reference in terms of the impact so far that you're hearing from your members and others?
Sure. So, of course, it goes without saying that this remains to be seen, as both of you have mentioned, because it's so new. I mentioned the data point about the average difference between the legal regulated rent and preferential rent being $500. The amount of people who now have access to the possibility of rent regulation. But, I'm remiss that I haven't made clear to folks that this doesn't just happen overnight, right? Like, we don't just click our heels because of this law and all these towns are able to opt in. There's going to be a fight in each and every one of these. So the conversation with my members have been, how do we organize to make sure that the local municipality in Newburgh or in Wappinger Falls or in Ithaca votes for the Emergency Tenant Protection Act? So what people are preparing for are the studies that have to happen in each and every one of these municipalities to confirm that there is such a low vacancy rate that it quantifies into a housing emergency. So what people are gritting themselves for is the fight. And I think a lot of this is analogous to what was happening in the fight amongst workers for a minimum wage, right? There was a lot of fear around if it's $15 an hour, what's going to happen? And in some areas, some companies went partially automated. But for a lot of people, their hourly salary went up to $15 an hour. So I think that we're going to grapple with this. There's going to be some bumps along the road. But then that generally this will be good for people to be able to stay in their homes and continue to build community.
Let's dive into some questions. There have been some that have been submitted, some that are still circulating throughout here. And as you can see on the lovely screen, if I do my Vanna White and showing you to my right and to my left right now.
Kiki Shepherd.
My Kiki Shepherd, we can do that too right there. Y'all get that later on. The DOTC used the hashtag to tweet your question or write it on the index card so we can get it from you in these next 20 minutes. So let me toss this out there. We haven't really talked about quality of housing. We've talked about the numbers. We've talked about the personal impact. One question is here is how do we believe that the rent regulations will impact housing quality? Do you believe that quality will be improved, that there will be a setback? Obviously, there's been the conversations of because of MCIs and IAIs, will there be the lack of investment? Do we believe that that is a talking point versus factual? I'll start with Rafael since you mentioned MCIs and IAs earlier.
I think there's a high likelihood that we will see in certain types of buildings and in certain building stock, in particular the small buildings that I'm focused on, we will see housing quality diminish. That is already the housing stock that is most challenged in terms of housing quality. And I think the limitations on how owners are able to recoup costs for investments made is going to limit owners' ability to make investments. So what do you do about that? I think there are things that we could do. There was a time in this city where we had a program called J51. That was an abatement that was targeted specifically for building owners to make repairs in buildings and then get an abatement and incentive off of their tax bill. That program doesn't really get used anymore, hasn't been tweaked or touched in a very long time, and I think there are things that we can do to ensure that a specific type of housing stock that we're worried about can receive the investment that it needs.
The quality of the housing, will it be impacted, yay or nay, and why?
Sure. I'm going to continue to say that it remains to be seen. I think there are some landlords and landowners who, for whatever reasons, may or may not make repairs. But I would say, as enshrined in the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act, and get more closely ties together the warranty of habitability, which is that you have a covenant with your landlord that the apartment should be at a certain level, with their ability to pay rent, particularly as several aspects of the law delay eviction proceedings and give tenants more rights to be able to bring forth these issues on code enforcement. So while it is not directly separating itself from code enforcement and making them more stringent, it does particularly tie together the two when the landlord is seeking to go to court to receive rent. And I would say, part of our organizing outside of New York City around this, one of the biggest issues were code enforcement, right? And that the tenants didn't have enshrined with their rights to be able to organize. So part and parcel of what I think is going to happen with a lot of tenants outside of New York City who aren't used to being able to make these allegations about code enforcement, and that we'll see that happening a lot more. And I think what's really going to be a real arbitrator in this is how HCR, the Division of Housing Community Renewal, seeks to deal with this and quantify the conditions in the communities.
So,
can I just say something to that point about code enforcement real quickly?
Sure.
Because I think we're very lucky in New York City because we have the Housing Maintenance Code that governs housing quality for residential units. And we have a city that for many, many years has pumped tens of millions of dollars into a code enforcement team and system that enforces the housing maintenance code. So there are literally thousands of inspectors that inspect and have over the years inspected for housing quality. That system doesn't exist anywhere else in New York State. For the most part, Department of Buildings, building inspectors, people that issue permits for new building and renovations are the only people that are there to inspect. And so one of the things that I think we should be thinking about is how do we have a better system for enforcing housing quality across New York State?
So you had a perfect segue into my next question. So rent regulation can expand beyond New York City. A core question is this a good template? Should we take this outside the city as is? If not, and across the country, quite frankly, and if not, what would be one component of the rent regulations you think should be definitely expanded across the state?
I mean,
Go ahead.
I would just say the premise of rent regulation, which is about tenant protection and about effectively price control, controlling the rate at which rents can grow. To me, those two basic concepts are concepts that are transportable to other parts of the state and other parts of the country. I don't think that the incredibly expensive and complex system that we have here in New York City is what we should be exporting. The good news is there are now other models around the country of places that actually do this as effectively or more effectively than we do, and they do it more simply and more transparently.
Give us an example.
California just passed a new regulation. Oregon just passed new regulations. So there are places that are doing this, and I'm not expert in any of those places. I'm unfortunately only an expert here. But what I would say is we should be looking at those and understanding those as policymakers and figure out whether those systems work better in communities upstate that are nothing like New York City.
And I'm going to give Afua equal time on this, but I just want to be clear on one more part. What specifically about California happened that you think should be replicated?
They have a very simple way in which rents are set annually, which rent increases are set. It's tied to CPI, and it's a percentage over CPI.
What's CPI?
Consumer Price Index. There's no rent guidelines board. There's no politics in the rent guidelines board. There's no angry meetings with people from both sides yelling at each other. There's a formula, and it's tied to an index that is well known and well established. You could argue that the percentage over the index that California agreed to is too much, and that's a topic for another time. I'm not advocating that they did it exactly right, but what I am saying is that they put a system in place that everybody can understand and that is transparent.
So Afua, is this template a good one that should be expanded outside the city? And what changes do you think should happen in other parts, whether it be across the state or across the country?
Yes. So, yes, I think there are definitely aspects Rafael talked about when you strip all the excess verbiage, like the bare minimum of price setting and rental protections. Yes, we fought for it. So wholeheartedly, 100%, it should be stretched across the state. And I would agree, I think there should be aspects of more transparency and that there should be more support given both to local municipalities as they seek to do this in an honest and intentional way, and that there should be more investment to HCR if that's going to continue to be the entity that oversees all of this.
And diving into that, just as a quick follow-up, Home Community Renewal is the agency. What particularly about HCR needs to have more support in order to do this well or better?
Sure. So I think the section of the Rent Administration Bureau should be working more, should have more staff so that they can work hand in hand with the municipalities as they enact rent regulation or the Emergency Tenant Protection Act. There should be standardized groupings of entities that help to do the vacancy studies, which is what I mentioned, the first step in these new municipalities, that they have to have a study to ensure that there's a certain amount or a low enough threshold of available units.
Next question here, Jay-Z or Rakim?
Rakim.
I'm sorry, I know who Jay-Z is. I don't know who
Rakim?
Rakim is. I'm sorry.
Would you go
I don't know who that is. Sorry.
Knicks or Nets?
Knicks,
Knicks.
Yankees, Mets?
Yankees.
I'm from the Bronx.
You didn't ask the most
Yankees.
important question, though.
Which is?
Let's go Buffalo Bills.
Oh.
Wow, the room got real uncomfortable right there.
The only New York football
The only
team.
New York. Yes, I hear that from our DNC chair, Tom Perez, all the time. The only New York team.
Smart man.
He's a very smart man. Thank him for leading the DNC. What would you both say to New York City residents who do not live in rent-regulated apartments? I'll start to my left to go back. So I'll start with Afua.
Organize.
Go further.
So, listen, if we're honest, a lot of New Yorkers are catching hell, right? Those who live in rent-regulated and those who do not live in rent-regulated. And it's unsustainable, this current model, where folks are 2 and 3 people in an apartment, each of them paying about $2,000 worth of rent. Who can save? Who can pay for all the other things in life that you need? I know that I'm in this situation like most youngish New Yorkers where I'm paying school loans. I'm on the precipice of probably paying for on my children for their future school loans, all while trying to pay rent and Metro cards and all of the other things that come. And so when I say organize, it's not a cheap throwaway, right? Power comes from organized people. And I referenced that earlier for how we were able to mount this large battle to hopefully bring about rent regulations. We'll see how it's enacted. So organize means something strong to me, something very serious about joining institution, relating to one another, and collectively sharing your power. And I think that folks who are not in rent-regulated unit, particularly newer folks who are coming to New York City with the big dreams, we're at NYU, right, where so many students are receiving an amazing education, but will probably be saddled with some student debt while also trying to tackle exorbitant rents, and that they can join together with their rent-regulated neighbors to think about how we organize and do this better. So when I say organize, it's a bold step in the future.
You know, I think, I guess what I would say to anybody, rent-regulated or not rent-regulated, because as I mentioned before, you know, rent-regulated tenants are actually more rent burdened than non-rent regulated tenants. What I would say is understand the full breadth of the system, avail yourself of all of the options to help you with your housing challenge. There are lots of organizations out there that do this, that help people navigate the system. And there are tools that you can use to ensure that, one, your rights are protected, and two, that that you can find a better living situation if that's what you seek.
There's a question here that I want to slightly modify, if that's all right for the person that asked this question, because the question essentially is how to practically help a person, and so that's going through these challenges, and we've talked about income inequality and affordability and rent, et cetera. Is there a resource that you want to share right now if you are a renter, how they can get help? And if you are a landlord, how they can get help?
So in a broad question, I would say if they are a renter who wants to know their rights, they can go to many institutions across the city, like a Tenants and Neighbors, like a Metropolitan Council on Housing, like a Community Voices Heard, like a Make the Road. They can also call 311 to find a local social service agency in their area who can help them assess if they're being rent overcharged, or if this is eviction, they can be directed to a legal services agency.
So CVH, Metropolitan Council,
Tenants and Neighbors.
Tenants and Neighbors, and Make the Road.
Make the Road, or 311.
Or 311.
I mean, I think for small owners who are in need of help and seeking help, I think that the best channel is 311, and to HPD, the Neighborhood Services team at HPD works with owners to help guide them and steer them to resources that are available to help them.
We got agreement on the answer. 311. All right. There is a God. Okay. Do you agree that landlords of smaller buildings are facing similar challenges that a tenant is facing? Yes or no?
Similar challenges. I mean, I think the economic at a very broad scale, the economic challenges that small building owners face are, not comparable at scale maybe, but comparable in the sense of the economics aren't working for them any more than they are for tenants.
And then, Afua, do you believe that our landlords of smaller buildings are facing similar challenges that a tenant is facing, yes or no?
I think some may. I think it's also important that we quantify what we mean by small building owner, but I think some people are facing all types of challenges. So yes, I'm sure there are landlords smaller and even some bigger who are. I'm not sure if it, depending on the circumstances, may or may not be equitable to a tenant, but sure.
Now, this is going to be a little awkward as an elected official standing here. If political feasibility and politics were not a concern, what policies would you proactively seek to implement and improve the current law? So you get one shot to try it again as is. So the law is passed. What's something you think needs to happen if politics are not the concern? See, y'all both y'all smirking too much right
Hold
now.
on, no, it's specifically related to rent regulation?
Correct.
Oh.
So we are starting from the place. See again.
Well, that's
Sherry,
too bad.
people tried to go all over the place right there, right?
Because I have good ideas on the other side, but
I
non-regulation
welcome the
side,
other
but-
ideas after 8 o'clock tonight, right now. Yeah. So, law has passed. Politics out the way. What's one policy you think should be done to make it better or stronger?
Well, I'm going to be bold and crazy. I think we should eliminate the Rent Guidelines Board. I think we should find a way to set rents on an annual increase basis that is devoid of politics. And the only way to do that is to eliminate the Rent Guidelines Board. That's what I would do.
I don't think that's a crazy idea.
I mean, so I would add in a section for municipalities who refuse to opt in to ETPA or to rent regulations, that they would have to draft and enact a substantial plan on how they're going to create affordable housing that meets the needs that were not met by the refusal to opt in.
And so on that point, what can be done to actually build more truly affordable housing? We know affordability is relative to the person, and affordability is tied to area median income, which obviously is a federal HUD regulation. We all appreciate that. What can be done to actually build more affordable housing, actually make it easier for our communities? Again, is there a practical, specific thing you think we need to go after?
So, several, and I just want to unpack some things that may also be crazy. I believe that there are renters and landowners who actually want to come together to have conversation. That doesn't mean it won't be a conversation that's not filled with tension where people won't agree. But I think if the guiding principle, the mission, is that we value people who live in New York and we don't want them to leave this state because they can no longer afford it due to rent prices and other things, that there might be some small areas of opportunity where we agree and can move forward an agenda. So, I mean, I always believe that you try and talk, particularly to unlikely bedfellows. But moving further, I would say that we would have to, frankly, push our governor as he's thinking about a fourth term to what is a bold housing vision, because a lot of the building of affordable housing doesn't come out of the ether. It's usually supported by the federal and the state governments. So what is the appetite of Governor Cuomo to support landowners, to support folks who want to build deeply affordable housing? And what is the appetite when we talk about the issue of politics in Albany, that pales in comparison to what's going on in Washington, D.C., but what is the appetite to even go in and wage that battle together jointly?
Look, I think that there's no state or city in the nation that does more using its own resources, city and state resources, to build and preserve affordable housing than New York. So I think we should consider ourselves very lucky that we have what we have on the production side. I actually think that the future really is not about building or preserving more affordable housing. It's about expanding access on the demand side. So more access to rental housing vouchers for the very, very lowest income. Targeting the rental housing vouchers that we have and using them more strategically to target the lowest income households. To me, we've over my 30 years in doing this work in New York, this city has spent more money than any of us could imagine building and preserving affordable housing. And I'm very proud of that, and I'm very proud of the record, and I'm very proud of all of the people that have been in this world for a very long time. But building units or preserving units is not the only answer, and we've got to start thinking outside the box about how do we actually reach the people that are at the very lowest end of the income span.
Two very fast questions. One is a yes and no, and one is a big thinking question here to wrap us before closing statements. Yes or no, would you support government subsidy for repairs by landlords, given the challenge that we're talking through right now?
Yes, we have it already, but we need more, yes.
How much further?
I think look, we have had historically programs in New York that have provided both low interest loans and tax abatements, and I think we need to be sure those are updated and fully working in this environment.
Afua, yes or no to the question about government subsidy for repairs by landlords?
Similarly, I would answer yes, and was going to raise what Rafael did about we already have existing tax abatements. I would think it should be expanded as we expand rent regulation to other cities and small towns, but also first get a deep understanding of what the benefits have been and what the yield has been when those tax abatements and subsidies were made available.
You had a whole front row nodding right here that I saw that happened right there.
That's their business.
Yeah, you know, we haven't talked about opportunity zones. That's a whole other conversation that we need to dive into one of these days. Mm-hmm. And then lastly, before we do closing statement, what is the big question that is still unresolved that needs to be resolved? So we've talked through the changes. We've talked through the both sides of it all. We leave from here tonight, Afua first and Rafael. What is that big item that is still out there?
That even though we are exceedingly proud and excited for what may be before us, that we are not doing nearly enough. Listen, in the New York Times article, it was cited that more than 100,000 children were in and out of the shelter system during the school year. Clearly, we're not doing enough, right? So the big idea or the big proposition of what's left, so much is left, right? And I understand my colleagues talking about what New York City has done, and they've done deeper investments than most cities across the country. But we're still not nearly there. When each of us walk here, we're going to probably walk over someone or walk past someone who's laying on the street in the sidewalk. And the countless folks who raised their hand when they talked about being rent burden and what that does for their considerations about staying in New York. So I would say the big proposition is that we have miles and miles to go.
Rafael, big
I
question.
mean, I think for me the big question is if we're really going to simply apply the New York City model across upstate New York, how do we ensure that those cities that don't have the tax base that we do, that don't have the tax revenue that we do, that don't have the financial riches that New York City does, how do we ensure that they have the resources and the supports necessary to not just say we have rent regulation, but to support both tenants and owners when that system gets implemented? Because they don't have it right now. And it's going to be very hard to figure out how you fund it and how you allow them to have the same supports that we do in New York.
I used a little moderator privilege right there, so this is going to drive into the closing statement. I think you both started to tee it up a little bit. We're going to do 2 minutes instead of 3 minutes here because I think we've driven home the points. And we're going to flip this a little bit. Rafael, I'm going to ask for you to do the first closing statement, and Afua to bring us home on closing us out on your perspective on the debate.
Look, I think, you know, obviously I think I've been a bit of a broken record, but I think, you know, ultimately the question is why would we want to implement the same system that was built and designed for New York City in places that don't look anything like New York City? And I fundamentally believe that the lawmakers in our state, the elected officials in our state, the tenants in our state, the owners in our state, the advocates in our state are smart enough to be able to step out of that construct and say, okay, what does real housing policy look like, and how do we learn from others and design a system that works for other places in the state, and not just drop New York City's model on top of Buffalo.
Afua.
Sure. In part of my opening statement, I talked about that this fight is not about widgets or units in the abstract, but actually about people. So I just want to take a second to recognize some amazing sheroes and heroes who have been part of fighting for rent regulation and are looking to dive deeper into how we can make this system even better. Women like Sheila Vereen Massengill, who's a lifelong Ossining resident, who organized people in her building at great risk to herself on the hopes of what would happen if she had the right to an annual lease renewal. Women like Sandra McCleary from Newburgh, who lives in Chadwick Gardens, a mother and a home health aide, who is now organizing her her neighbors to think about how we are able to come together to have rent regulation enacted in Newburgh. And the thousands of other New Yorkers who have been having difficult conversations at their kitchen tables, who have been thinking about this deeply. Right? I think folks have seriously been thinking about this and what it can mean going forward. To the millions of families who are leaving New York City, or I'd say thousands who are leaving New York City and going further north up the I-87 corridor, looking for stability for themselves to try to go to housing markets that are more affordable. This is about hopefully being able to make space where you can make those communities a home and have stability. But this is just the beginning. And so I want to, in my closing, thank the amazing members of Community Voices Heard who get up and fight a tireless fight every day and don't get to be on podiums in rooms like this before you. But they are the amazing people who are doing this, not just for themselves, but for children and future generations. So I thank them, and I thank all of you tonight.
Let's give our debaters a round of applause, everybody. I want you both to stand up, stay up here with us right now. This is your time to get your good final photos, everybody in the room. Use a flash. I'm a dark brother. Help me out right now, everybody, if you take a picture right there. So we're going to conduct the poll one more time to see if opinions have shifted. So take out your phones, everyone. We have, or you can just do it via the browser that's on the screen, pollev.com/DOTC. And again, the core question, we should expand the use of rent regulation in New York. We should expand the regulation. That is the core question at hand. Let's go.
Text DOTC.
So right at the top. So you can either text DOTC 37607, or you can do it by responding. And the question you are answering, we should expand the use of rent regulation in New York. Yes, no, or undecided. We'll give it one more minute. We got a nice little battle going on right here. Not everybody's polled. It shows 64 results. There's more than 64 in this room right now. Thirty more seconds to text DOTC to 37607 or to respond online. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Wow. 41% yes, 43% no, 16% undecided. As we see what's happening here. One more time, we just want to thank everyone for being here tonight. We had a packed room. We had folks following us on live stream. I think it's a very clear indication of the support and the questions around this. To Mark and the Century Foundation, to Sherry and NYU, thank you, everybody. Have a great night.
It's great. Thank you.
We're going to stand here.